First, I want to just quickly review in images what we've studied so far this semester. I didn't do it on Tuesday, but I always like to do this just to emphasize that I always approach my drawing courses as cumulative. In other words, what we learn one day, we bring into the next and build upon. And I just like to remind people the elements of drawing that we're studying. Actually, I just noticed something about this image here. This image, we've talked a lot about perspective, which this image is just representing the fact that we went over the basic principles of perspective. I did mention that perspective is really an artificial system. Perspective is not really the way we see. And the reason for that is that perspective is based on the idea that the viewer is in an absolutely fixed position, and we are never looking at the world from an absolutely stable and fixed position, right? We're always moving at least a little bit. And perspective also relies or depends on or is based on the idea that we are looking at the world with one eye closed. And of course, we don't do that, right? We look at the world with binocular vision, in other words, with both of our eyes. That visual information is taken in by both eyes, and then our optic nerves and our brain combines that image into what registers as the representation in our head. So perspective can't take in that exactly take in the way we see according to binocular vision. And we also register, sorry. Sorry about that, that's my son calling. Let me just text him quickly and let him know. We also, because of the curvature of the lens of our eye, we actually register straight lines as if they're slightly curved. So we would not, we actually would not see these lines as absolutely straight, even though we technically perceive them that way. So perspective can lead to distortions as you move away from a limited point of view, unless you correct for that. And notice how this drawing is actually distorted over here. So this drawing is a depiction of square tiles on a floor plane. So you see them here. And the floor plane, the square tiles on the floor plane where they are close to the vanishing point and within the center of vision, they read as convincing. But notice how as we move further and further away from that vanishing point, these tiles become distorted and they no longer look like they are perspectival representations of a square tile. So that does happen in perspective. So you have to, when you're using perspective, you have to figure out where to place the vanishing point so that you don't end up with that distortion. So sorry, that was a little aside, but I think a useful one. So we did our studies of perspective. We did this exercise where we studied conceptual perspective, in other words, perspective not based on observation. We applied that to a very simple still life, applying it to our geometric forms. Then we adapted that to a more complex linear still life and incorporated into our still life's organic forms and interpreted them according to the way we understand simple geometric forms to operate in a perspective space. And on Tuesday, we studied light and shadow. So we broke down the elements of light and shadow and looked for them in the drawings we did. So we have our light mass and our dark mass. We talked about those elements of light and shadow, the core of the shadow, the reflected light, the shadow edge or the terminator. Oh, I left that out, didn't I? Okay. The cast shadow, occlusion shadow, halftone, center light, highlight. And we talked about how that applies to a more complex organic form. So today I want to, and we did our drawing, and hopefully people developed a drawing up to the level, or as well as you could, up to the level of this egg here, taking that development into not only the cone, but everything else around it. And again, I asked people to do it for a class period, so about 3.5 hours, no need to go beyond that. So we studied light and shadow as we studied the basic principles of light and shadow, but we studied them as a careful gradation, right? The gradation of that light and shadow as it wraps around these forms. And these are relatively simple forms, but we treated them as as relatively smooth gradations. So I want to, in a sense, back up a little bit. And I want to look a little bit more deeply at why we register light and shadow on forms by analyzing a little bit with a little bit more, in a little bit more depth, the planar structure of objects, or how we can understand objects as having what I call a planar structure, and how that's relevant to us in the way we understand light and shadow on volumes, and how that can be useful for us in making drawings. So we're going to talk a little bit about, we're going to go back into conceiving of organic volumes and conceiving of the objects we look at in the world in terms of this kind of breakdown of organic forms as planar structures. In other words, a simplification of organic forms so that we conceive of them, and can I conceive of them as planar, as being composed of a series of planes, and understand how we can usefully use that in our drawings. So this is a kind of famous drawing on the left. That's maybe an overstatement, but it's a drawing that frequently appears in books on how to draw. It's a 16th century drawing by a relatively unknown artist named Luca Cambiaso. But Cambiaso did this somewhat curious thing in that he always started his works of art, so primarily paintings, by developing his compositions, by starting with these drawings where he analyzes all of the figures that will end up in his compositions as clear, planar structures. So eventually he'll develop these studies so that this figure and all the figures here are rendered something like this drawing over here as a more fully realized organic form. But he always starts with this conceptualization. And he starts with this conceptualization so he can, one, understand very clearly how the complex volumes of a figure will clearly move through space. So in other words, if we're dealing with all the complexity of a human figure, let's say we're looking at, let's take this figure here in the foreground, and let's imagine that figure as a life model posing for us. So we're looking at a life model with all of the complexities and all of the irregularities of the organic form of the human body. It's relatively difficult to deal with all of that complexity and at the same time make a very clear representation of the big space that the large volumes of the human body occupy. So to clearly get a sense of the movement from the hips of the figure backwards in space to where the shoulders sit in relationship to the head, and so on. Or for that matter, the relationship of the hips of the figure to the torso of this figure in the background, right? Cambiaso has successfully set up the spatial relationship between all of those elements, between the elements in the figure itself, hips to shoulder, let's say, that spatial movement, and the elements between figures, shoulder of the foreground figure to shoulder of the background figure. So when you're conceiving of the body as made up of simple masses, simple planar masses, it's much easier to conceive of that body as existing in a clearly defined space. So an artist like Tadao Zuccaro, who did this drawing on the right, a drawing I happen to think is particularly beautiful in the very convincing representation of the organic structure, the space of the body, the small details on the larger form, the simple and yet at the same time very full and rich rendering of light and shadow. So when all of those elements are present, but what am I talking about when I refer to the large space that this figure occupies? So if we look at this figure, we can be seduced by all of the complexity of the rendering. So the small forms, the large masses, and so on. But notice how we have a very, very clear sense of a drop in space from, let's say, this point on the figure. This is a muscle called the external oblique. This point is close to us. And this point is very clearly further away from us, right? And then this point on the shoulder is very clearly closer to us than the hand, which is very clearly further away from us. So Tadao Zuccaro, before he got involved in any of the small rendering, had conceived of the large space that these volumes occupy. And I guarantee you he conceived of them in this kind of conceptual simplification. Now, he may not have done a drawing like this before doing this one. That conceptualization may have just happened in his head, and probably did. Nevertheless, look how there's a complexity of rendering and detail in this shadow mass. But at the same time, we very clearly can see the fact that the shadow mass moves in an unmistakable way through space from the shadow edge or the terminator, which is closer to us here, and then we drop back in space to the far edge of the torso. In the same way that we have a very clear sense of the movement in space from the terminator in this geometric drawing on the left, and then that as that side plane of the torso moves into shadow, we have a clear sense of this plane dropping away from us in space to this point, right? So we have a clear sense of this point being closer to us than this point. Again, in the Tadao Zuccaro, we have a clear sense of this position in space being closer to us than this point being closer to us than this. Notice here on the leg, right? We wrap around, obviously he hasn't done a lot of rendering here, but we wrap around the volume of the leg here, and then at the terminator, we drop back in space along that shadow plane. So look at the shadow plane on this figure in the background of the Cambiasso drawing. So he has simplified the volumes of the thigh into a major front plane that's in light, and then a major shadow plane. So we have a clear sense of moving through space, right? Across and then backwards in space. And in exactly the same way, the Tadao Zuccaro drawing moves across the light plane and then backwards on the shadow plane. So there's a planar understanding operating in these drawings. And again, I want to show this drawing because this is a drawing that was in your sketchbook this week. And it's a kind of drawing you're going to be encountering in the sketchbooks throughout the week. These drawings I'm asking you to copy. So in this case, a George Bridgman drawing. And I want you to be conscious of this sensibility that we're going to be studying, this planar sensibility, and asking yourself how the planar sensibility that you engage with in doing these copies can be applied to the organic objects you're going to be looking at and making and attempting to make convincing, illusionistic, structural, perspectival drawings of. Again, we looked at this planar drawing by Albrecht Dürer to help us see the way artists start to understand again, the complexity of the human form in planar terms, and the way we can understand this planar structure, the simplified planar structure, and see it operating in this Katie Kollwitz drawing, right? There's the correspondence of the shadow planes in the Katie Kollwitz drawing, and the believable way those shadow planes show us the form moving through space, right? The sense of that roundness of the front plane of the face, and then at the terminator, the form changes direction and moves backwards in space, right? At an oblique angle to the picture plane. The same way we have that sense of the front plane in the Dürer drawing, and then the terminator showing us where the shadow plane begins, and the shadow plane wrapping around in space at an oblique angle to the picture plane. So I want to do an exercise today where we take our understandings of perspective, our understanding of light and shadow and the elements of light and shadow, and really think about how the planar structure of objects relates to those concepts. Okay, so let me just adjust my camera here for a minute. So now this may be entirely review, but I think it's worth clarifying something. So I want to be clear what I mean when I'm talking about a plane and planar structure. It's not necessarily exactly clear to everybody. So we're looking at my teaching board here. We're looking at the shelf, right, that I often put our objects on. And we can think of all these surfaces as plane surfaces, right? These are all planes. In other words, a flat surface, right? This sheet of oak tag paper is also a plane. So when I say a plane, I simply mean a flat surface. A flat surface, it may be of different shapes, but that's what I'm talking about. And when we're thinking about drawing, our planes are often curving planes, right? So a plane may be a straight plane, but we're often going to be conceiving of objects as being made up of curving planes, okay? So we're going to be thinking about how objects are constructed of a series of planes that slowly turn into one another. And when we look at light and shadow, we're going to be thinking about the way light and shadow is created by a sequence of planes in various relationships to a light source. So this is a sheet of, obviously a sheet of oak tag that is bent into a series of planes. And we see light and shadow on objects because objects are constructed of a series of planes that are in different relationships to a light source. Okay, so like we're seeing here on this little prop. So I have light, as people can see, coming in from the left, right? My objects right now are illuminated just with the window to the left of my setup. So I have a north light studio, so when light comes in just one side. And this simple planar construction is made up of three planes. One plane is relatively parallel to the light source. In other words, it's for the most part facing the light source. Light source is coming in like this, and it's hitting that plane. The rays of light are hitting that plane directly. This plane here is not completely turned away from the light source, but it's at an oblique angle to the light source, right? So if the plane of the light source is a plane in relationship to the objects that's at a direction about like this, then this plane here is at an oblique angle to that. So it's not getting direct rays of light. The rays of light are hitting that at an angle. So we are not able to optically register the true local value of this plane. We're seeing that plane somewhat darker because not a lot of light is hitting it. This plane here is turned away from the light source. So this plane is in shadow, right? So this plane is not getting any direct light at all. There's no light hitting this plane. No direct light hitting that plane. So if there's no light on an object, in theory, we shouldn't be able to see it. It should just go black, right? It should go black according to the principles of light and shadow. But of course, we've talked about why we do see that, because that's being hit by light reflecting off of other surfaces in the room. So one of the primary reflecting sources in this case is that piece of paper. There's sunlight reflecting here. So we're seeing reflected light on this shadow mass, but that reflected light also always has to be understood as relatively darker than any of the light surfaces. So before I go on, does anyone have any questions about some of these basic ideas of planes and how they register light and shadow? Okay. So I'm going to go back to my yellow block, and then I'm going to put next to the yellow block my pepper. Whoops. And I'm going to turn that pepper in about the same degree as the block. So we can now, thinking about those elements of light and shadow, thinking about those elements of planar structure and light and shadow, let's look at the way an organic form relates to a very simple form, right? So a very simple form made up of basically 6 planes, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the plane underneath, 6 planes. We can see 2 of those planes. One of those planes is facing the light source, so it's illuminated, strongly illuminated. One of those planes is turned away from the light source, so that's in shadow. Notice how much darker the shadow plane is in terms of value than the light plane, right? Considerably darker. We have a relatively complex organic form, this pepper. It's an artificial pepper, but it doesn't matter. That has one primary light plane, right? Or from our point of view. Just like this cube, that light plane is illuminated. Here's the terminator or the shadow edge, and then the plane of the pepper that's turned away from the light source, and that plane is parallel, basically parallel to the plane on the box. That entire plane goes into shadow. Just to make the shadow a little bit more clear, let me put this piece of black board behind it. I'm going to block, just to block the reflecting surfaces. And you can see how that shadow, how the shadow side of the object, how the plane on that object turned away from us goes into shadow. Very similar to the way the plane on the cube goes into shadow. So the reason understanding and thinking about planar structure is important is with a simple form like this, made up of simple planes, it's relatively easy for us to represent this form, especially when we're using light and shadow in addition to perspective. It's relatively easy for us to communicate to the viewer that this plane is considerably closer to us than this plane. When we start rendering in light and shadow on organic forms, we tend to get bogged down in a lot of little sort of insignificant information, and we lose sight of the fact that what we're really trying to do is create a completely convincing sense of the roundness of that volume and the fact that it's occupying space. And we lose sight of the fact that we're trying to clearly articulate spatial relationships from distance to something closer to us and then further away in space. But thinking about these objects as clear planar objects helps us to better understand how we can represent these complex forms in space. So any questions about any of that? Okay. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go back to a small still life drawing. And we're going to interpret the still life drawing. Today we're just going to be using organic forms. We're going to be illuminating our still life with light and shadow. And I'm going to turn on a light. So you're going to want to set up your objects in your box so that you have a clear light and shadow situation. And we're going to interpret these objects in terms of their planar structure. So we're going to be using light and shadow, and we're going to be using a planar understanding or a way of interpreting these objects as planar masses. So just because I didn't have this set up before, I'm going to need to stabilize these objects. So if you wouldn't mind just giving me a second. So I use this stuff called museum wax, which allows me to get these objects to stay put. Otherwise, these are going to wobble around. This is kind of cool stuff, by the way. I don't know if anyone has cats, but my kids have cats and they like to knock things over. And this is the type of stuff you can use to stabilize things in your house. I'm going to raise this so you can see the top of so you can better see the top of the objects as I can. Okay. Okay, so before I go on, I'm gonna stop the share again, or I'm gonna do a new share. Let me go back to my slides. I'll show you one more slide. And actually, let me show you a quick video as well before we get started. Okay, so this this was a video still from a video you can find on YouTube, which shows an artist interpreting the structure of an organic object, in this case a pear, obviously, according to a planar conceptualization. Now, to be honest with you, I think that the planar structure the artist has used here is a little bit too generic. In other words, it doesn't quite correspond to the actual planar structure of the object that he's looking at, but it gives you some sense of what the artist is, or how we're going to be thinking of planes. This is just a little bit too generic. I'm going to be thinking about planes a little bit more related specifically to the object we're looking at. Now, and I'll show you what I mean by that. I said I was going to show a video. I'll actually show you the video at the end, because I think it's a decent resource, or that's a decent resource. I'm going to leave. I'll do this. You can't see the entire sheet of paper, but I don't think that matters. I think that maybe this will give you all a better view both of what I'm drawing and I'm just finding the right pencil to use. So I think for today, for this drawing, I'm going to use a darker pencil than I've typically been using. I'm going to use a 6B pencil. I didn't ask you all to buy a 6B pencil. I asked you to buy a 4B, so you could use that. You certainly don't have to. You could do this with a lighter pencil. So again, just sharpening the pencil. So in doing the drawing, I am going to be thinking about all of the different elements we've talked about. So I'm blocking in these forms in a very simple way. Let me move this over a little bit so it's more clearly in. So I'm thinking in a very planar way, using the same kind of straight line approach to blocking in the form. I'm going to work a little bit more broadly. So I've started my contour. I'm going to go right into using the light and shadow that's showing me where the planes of the object are changing direction, right? So I immediately used that shadow edge plane. So right away, I've set up the object as a planar structure. And I can, because we're going to be rendering, I'm going to be doing a little bit of a broader kind of rendering. And so I'm blocking in that light and shadow, very much conscious of setting up a plane moving from a point close to me to a point further away, right? So that's, with this kind of planar thinking, I'm immediately conceiving of objects as wrapping around in space. So here's a point closer to me, and then that volume moves around this way, right? It wraps and curves around in space. So I'm immediately trying to set up that consciousness or set up the illusion of that kind of planar movement. So I'm going to just start refining some of this, and I'm not concerned so much with keeping the drawing that kind of cleaned up way I did before. So I also see I'm taking note of the top plane of this object, and I'm going to start constructing that top plane. So that the top plane, I note the top plane of the object because these bumps at the top of the piece of fruit show me the top front edge of this plane. And then from here backwards, I'm getting a kind of tabletop-like plane. And then I notice these little bits of light showing the side plane. Now, if I do anything here that doesn't make total sense to anybody in terms of conceiving of and drawing planes, don't hesitate to stop me and ask me to explain. Okay. So I'm going to block in a little bit more clearly. I'm going to put in my cast shadow. So you can see with this 6B pencil, it's much easier to put down a big, large mass of tone. Okay, so now I want to start drawing my hair. I'm using all of the same techniques. I'm looking at height relationships. So where does the pear intersect with the pepper? I'm looking for planar simplification of that contour. I'm going to look at the relationship of the bottom of the pepper to the bottom of the pear. What is that relationship? So the pear is slightly higher. I'm going to measure the width of the pepper compared to the width of the pear. The pepper is a little bit wider than the pear because of the foreshortening of the pear. So now here's, notice how this pear, we could think of this pear as being made up of a sphere, right, an egg-like sphere, and then a kind of cylinder inserted into it. So, and it's a kind of planar cylinder. So I'm going to trace out that cylinder. So notice here, we can register, we can see the top of the cylinder. Notice how very clearly we can see a planar division on the pear from this point to this point, and then from this point to this point, we can see a sequence of planar shifts, right? And then we have a little plane in here, and so on. And we can start tracing out very clearly that planar structure. So I'm gonna, I need to move down that a little bit. Look how clearly we can conceive of this contour as being made up of two straight lines, right? Or more, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So the pair is particularly, or lends itself particularly well to a planar understanding. And now I'm going to think about those planar shifts. So that we've indicated with the Sharpie, and start to trace out the structure of that protruding mass that we consider characteristic of a pair, right? That mass that projects off the top of the pair. Now again, we're dealing today with the distortion of the camera. So the proportions of my pair look quite different from the proportions of the pair as you're seeing it on the camera. That's because, as this curves away from you, because of the curvature of the lens of the camera I'm using, that distorts. So just bear that in mind. Although, having said that, I do need to make my pair a little bit shorter, because if I remember correctly, when I took the measurement, the pair was actually smaller. My mistake. The pear should be that wide compared to the apple. Compared to the pepper. So I'll make that proportion change. And I'm always going to be looking to get convincing proportion. So again, we're going to be doing a kind of rough planar drawing. So I'm not so concerned today with using marks that will get me a very clean line. And don't hesitate to be a bit messy, to state things very broadly in this drawing. So just now refining the contour. And so one important thing I want to consider is I'm looking at the bottom line of the contour of the pair and really thinking about how that bottom line tells me or shows me the way that pair sits on the planar surface of the shelf that I've placed it on. Always want to be conscious of how these lines, the contour of the object, is revealing to me the way the object moves through space. So this line here, that bottom line of the pair, needs to move in such a way that I believe that it is moving along the planar surface of, the planar surface of the shelf it's sitting on. So these contours are not lines that delimit shapes, although they do that in part, but they're much more lines that show me the movement of these of these objects through space. So the bottom lines of my pepper, I want those lines to relate to or clearly communicate to me the fact that those are objects sitting on the plane, flat surface of the shelf on which they're placed. Okay, so I have the start of my planar study. And I can go in, and again, in a very broad planar way, I'm not trying to create a finely rendered and modulated series of tones the way we did on our egg study. I'm just starting to indicate those large elements of light and shadow and how they relate to the planar structure I'm observing. So I'm going to go in now on the pair, and I'm going to block in very broadly the planar structure of this object. So looking at the simple planar shadow edge or terminator, and so the complexity of the form. So I've plotted out a side plane to this top form of the pepper, right? A side plane that I can identify by looking at these 4 points, right? So those 4 points show me a side plane of that object if I connect to those 4 points. But the actual object itself is a little bit more organically complex. So I'm going to, using planes, I'm going to indicate those simplification of that relatively complex form. And so looking at, again, looking at the totality of the light and shadow, very much so that it reveals to me the planar structure. So, and I'm going to block in the tone, light and shadow mass on this pepper so that I can depict it very clearly as light and shadow on planes, not just gradations of tone on a flat surface. So my light and shadow in every drawing I do is always going to be thought about and drawn so that it clearly reveals the movement of a plane through space. I never just want to use light and shadow to make a flat gradation on a surface, because a flat gradation on a surface does not show us volume moving through space.
Professor, how do you know the length of the cast shadow and the width? How do you figure that out?
That's also just exactly the same kind of proportional relationship. So, I wasn't even thinking too much about it, but I'm just looking at this height, where the cast shadow intersects with the contour of the object. I'm looking at the height of that cast shadow compared to other dimensions in my drawing. Does that make sense? It's just
Yes, thank you.
there is now. I know that cast shadows can be sometimes a little bit harder to identify than maybe I sometimes say, because a cast shadow is rarely um, just a kind of clean, very obvious shape. There's almost always light bouncing around. It makes it a little bit unclear. So you just have to, really clearly ask yourself, where does the cast shadow end, or better yet, where can I interpret it as ending for now, so that I can get in a clean, clear shape. And then I can, soften edges or make that shape more and more complex um, as I develop the drawing. So I'm just going to sharpen my pencil quickly before I go on here. So now I have the large shapes. I have the large volumes and the major division of light and shadow, showing me the major division of planes. So now I'm going to start looking within the form and carving out or indicating smaller and smaller planes. I want to do a relatively complete study of the planar structure of these objects. So I have my very simplified planes. So let's start with, I'm going to block in the plane, the core shadow plane on this object, right? So the core of the shadow, we actually can think of as a plane, because the core of the shadow, as I suggested the other day, is really in effect a plane that is neither facing the light source nor is it facing reflecting surfaces. So it's this usually a narrow plane within the shadow plane, within the larger shadow plane. And notice on the pair, it's fairly obvious that it's a kind of planar. We could read it as a planar, kind of thin plane crawling up the form just to the right of the terminator. And so we're now seeing further planes in here. And then notice how the plane in the shadow side of the pair, there's a major plane that's facing the reflecting surface of the pepper. And why do we know that? Because that area on the pepper is somewhat yellow, right? That area on the pepper is picking up as it reflects off the pepper, and as that light reflects off the pepper and then back into the pear, it's picking up some of that yellow color and reflecting that yellow back into the pear. And that plane that's receiving that reflection off the pepper has a shape something like this. So let's plot out so we have this plane here, that reflective surface of the pepper. Now we can continue our rendering of the light and shadow into this kind of tower-like structure. So I'm asking myself how I'm going to interpret the light and shadow on this. I don't know, I call this thing like the tower of the pair. I bet it has a technical name. So I'm always looking for the light and the shadow on these objects. Those elements of light and shadow on these objects. Here I'm drawing with the eraser. You can use your eraser as a kind of drawing tool. So I'm cutting away at the tone I've already put in as a way of clarifying form. Okay, so now I'm going to start looking for more and more complex representations of the planes on this object. So I see, just thinking about how to simplify the planes, I'm seeing a halftone plane in here. Now I'm looking for some of these halftone planes. And just following along, putting in subtle tones, following along that planar structure. Just in this process of analyzing the values so that they correspond to an underlying planar structure on the object. And I'm following along, as I'm putting in the tone, I'm following along on the planes. Here I'm just refining a little bit that core shadow plane. I'm noticing how at the very top of the shadow mass, I'm reading a kind of triangular plane at the very top. So there's a triangular plane up here that's receiving very little reflected light. Then there's a kind of transitional plane here that's receiving some reflected light. And then there's a turn in the plane here before we come down to the plane on the shadow mass of the pear that's directly facing the reflective surface of the pepper. And then when that reflective surface of the pepper turns away from, or turns under as the pear rolls around in space, it no longer receives that reflected light from the pepper and goes back into a darker mass. So I'm looking, as I'm blocking in all these areas of tone, I'm looking at these areas as, again, tone used to block out and indicate these planar divisions on the form. So I'm identifying a front plane here on the pepper, or a top plane if that pepper were right side up, and then a series of faceted planes as that form rolls around in space. I'm looking at how the tones on the rest of the pepper are determined by the particular planar structure, and again, the relationship of those planes to the light source. So on the top plane, as we're looking at this pear, there's a subtle tone here. And then as the form turns direction, you see a plane that's facing the camera a little bit more. So we have a small facet there that's receiving relatively more light. So I'm going to start doing the same thing to my pepper. I'm going to start to look for the halftone planes. So there's a kind of a sort of inverted triangular shape of halftone. I'm noticing between it's a transitional halftone plane between the light plane and the shadow plane. And if anyone doesn't see these planes that I'm looking at, please be sure to let me know. There's a portion of the top plane of the pepper rolls underneath. It goes into the shadow as it approaches. As it approaches the stem. So as I'm putting down these different tones, I'm looking at these, all of this information I'm putting down, I'm thinking about it as a plane and a value. So a plane and then the value that that plane has depending on its position in relationship to the light source. And this is not different from the way we would think about a finer, a finer gradation of tone, similar to what we did the other day with the cone and egg. But we're just really, in this case, emphasizing this kind of planar drawing. So emphasizing that above all else. So we're not necessarily concerned with, or you shouldn't be concerned with, making a very elegant, smoothly transitioning series of tones. You just want planes describing the movement, planes and tones that are describing their movement in space relative to one another. So just indicating these subtle movements on the main light plane of the pepper. Again, just searching out and trying to indicate the way the volume rolls around in space according to this method of simplified planes. Here I'm putting in the occlusion shadow or the shadow accent, and using that to define the bottom edge of that pepper.
Professor?
Yes.
I don't know if it's the camera or, but I see in the shadow mass another kind of sloping, kind of curving vertical line, not the shadow edge or the cast shadow, but kind of further back in space. And I'm just wondering if you see that or if that's just the camera or I'm not seeing.
No, I see that. So you're talking about this movement from. So here's the core of the shadow.
Yeah.
We'll reflect a kind of S-shaped band of reflected light. Then we get another relatively dark area of the shadow, and then another reflected light. Right.
Right, but there's also, it seems like from where I'm looking, there's also kind of a vertical there, right where you said. So right, that patch of dark, the patch of shadow after the reflected light, that runs into a vertical line as well.
Okay, where's the vertical? You mean, are you talking about this as the vertical?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so we do get a series, we do get further planes within the shadow. So, okay, a couple things about that is I tend to minimize information within the shadows. So, and that's it's actually a kind of rule of drawing. It's not a, I mean, you'll hear that presented as a rule of drawing, that you minimize the information in the shadows and emphasize the information in the lights. And the idea is that the drawing works best when the shadow is portrayed as as just a loss of information. I don't know if that makes sense. There's this saying in drawing, in the teaching of drawing, to keep your lights active and your shadows passive. But so there's a little bit of that going on here. But I would, as I further develop this drawing, I would start bringing in that information that you're referring to. So let's do that. That's just something that I had not gotten to yet. I mean, that I would leave to a more fully developed stage of the drawing. But let's do that. Let's start doing that by pulling out. So I'm going to pull out with my eraser the reflected light plane at the far edge of the shadow mass. Now, usually I like to make the reflected lights by darkening around them. But in this case, I think it's appropriate perhaps to pull out some of the light. And I may go in and darken that again. But so I see a plane doing something like that. And then maybe I'm just going to slightly remove tone here. I'm going to use my stick eraser. Now I'm removing tone in order to get the reflected light that indicates the planes, in order to get the reflected light that's showing me those planes of the shift in the form within the shadows. But I always want to be very careful of making sure that these reflected lights, that these areas of reflected light do not get as light as anything within the light side of the form. So I may just go in and darken these again. And so this technique I'm using of using the eraser as a kind of drawing tool, not something just to remove mistakes, is something that I highly recommend. And that's something I think that this particular eraser is very useful for. Now, again, I tend to ignore those variations within the shadow because I think it's much more important for a successful drawing to keep the dark value of the shadows unified. And so I'll sacrifice some information in the shadows in order to emphasize the unity of the shadow mass. But if you observe these variations with the right subtlety, then you can have both. And there are artists who who like to emphasize the reflected lights. So I just did another pass over. So I took out tone in order to start carving out those planes. I'm going to do another pass over the whole shadow area so that those reflected lights stay clearly within the shadow. And then now I'll go in and start to clarify some of that. Some of those planes within the shadow mask by again darkening the core of the shadow. And now I'm going to darken this dark plane within the shadow mass. So are these the planes you were talking about, Sephi?
Yes.
You just want to make sure when you're finding those planes in the shadow mask that the values in the shadow don't get as light as the values in the light side of the form. But that certainly helped start to get a sense of this form really turning around in space. So I'm going to start using strokes moving around the surface to reinforce the sense of that planar structure. Again, I'm just looking at roughing in the big planar masses of these objects. So I'm using my eraser to just start to soften some of those divisions between planes. So indicating this, there's a little plane here. So thinking about all of these small elements I'm starting, or smaller and smaller elements I'm starting to observe on the object, I'm thinking of them as planes. And again, I want to emphasize that really that's this, you would be taking the same approach no matter how subtly you want to render the form. Any tone you put down, any half tone, no matter how complex, you always want to be thinking about it as a plane moving, as a tone that's sitting on a plane that's moving in a specific direction in space. So again, we're not trying to make a finely gradated tone. We're putting down planes and shadow masses in a way that they're absolutely descriptive of planar structure. And we're perhaps, or not perhaps, we're exaggerating a bit the planar structure just so that we start to develop a clear understanding of how that can work. So I have this simple division of this shadow mass into that shadow mass there, and then I'm seeing this halftone plane as a relatively simple halftone plane. Now I can go into that and start indicating the organic variations to that plane. I can pick out areas with my eraser. And retaining a planar consciousness, start to bring in more information so that I'm getting something that's starting to be closer and closer to something that's on the one hand planar, but at the same time starts to believably suggest the complexity of organic form. And so, you know, when we look at great drawings, you know, I know that that way to describe art is sort of out of fashion to call something great. But I guess I don't care. I think Michelangelo drawings or Rembrandt drawings or Katie Colwitz drawings are great drawings. Um, Whenever we look at those drawings, no matter what their level of finish is, the artists are always thinking in these conceptual terms, whether their drawing is ultimately finished in a clear conceptual planar way, or if it's finished in a way that more reveals the subtle gradations. This is nevertheless a really important way of thinking about how to clearly communicate the structure and space and complexity of organic form. This exercise also helps us start thinking about the different ways we can use marks of the pencil or whatever drawing tool we're using to reinforce the sense of the volume. So as I'm bringing in more subtle modeling on these objects, I'm using the tool to follow the form. A very useful way of rendering objects, and almost always, even in the most finely rendered drawings, the artist has done this. They've just done it in a way that eventually brings in more and more, or knits those strokes together with greater and greater subtlety. Virtually always. So I usually take, when we don't have COVID and hopefully we've turned that corner, I take my class to the drawing study at the Met, and we can see some of these drawings we've looked at in this class in person. So they'll pull that Michelangelo drawing we've looked at. And even in very subtle drawings like that, you see how the artist has used individual marks of the pencil or whatever drawing tool they were using to suggest, to build up the subtlety of those tones they're putting down. The Met's not allowing groups in yet, so we can't do that. But I think they will starting in the fall. Okay, so what I want to do is take our break here, and then we'll come back and I'll go over a few other things, and then we'll finish up for the day. So let's take our break, a 20-minute break, and we will start again at 11:11, okay?